Good afternoon, everybody. As most of you know, I am Cappy Powell, and I'm fortunate to be a member of the Johann Fust Library Foundation Board. On January 6, 1951, our founders, Roger and Louise Amory, opened the doors to this beautiful building. We will celebrate those 75 years since that day all season. This community has always been very supportive of this library, and our board and our foundation staff are very appreciative of your support. We are very proud of this building and the gardens, and that we are able to welcome you all here for our literary programs throughout each season. I've had the opportunity to introduce to you many of our past speakers through the past few years, but I am not doing that today. That is because I will introduce to you someone who needs no introduction, fellow board member Alice Gorman. She has been a longtime avid supporter of the Johann Fust Library Foundation and our mission. And she's an integral part of our history because she was one of the visionaries that helped steer our partnership with the Lee County Library System. I'm getting a little emotional. But Alice is not here today as board member emeriti. She is here because she is a very proud aunt. Or aunt? Did you say aunt last night, Libby? Please join me and show appreciation for Aunt Alice. She introduces her niece, and welcome to her sister who's here with us today.
Boy, are we lucky to have Cappy Powell as president of the board. She has done the most wonderful job. And to have Bobby Markey as our executive director. This library has never been in better shape than it is right now. And it is my joy to introduce my niece, Elizabeth Christian Gray Buck, AKA the author, Libby Buck. This is a singular honor for me. It's been a privilege to watch my sister Catherine's daughter grow up from the little girl that I knew from the summers in Maine, in Port Clyde, to the grown-up woman she is today, who has succeeded at everything she has ever attempted to do. She graduated from UVA with a degree in English, then achieved her master's in English from Columbia, and her doctorate at the University of North Carolina in art history. One of my favorite pictures of Libby is when she is dressed in her cap and gown, holding her newly received PhD, surrounded by her 3 girls, the youngest one not even a year old. In the years that followed, she raised those girls, all 3, to be remarkable, successful young women themselves. At some point, a number of years ago, she was inspired by a mystical muse to begin to write fiction. The poet and writer, Maya Angelou, says that there are 3 requisites for becoming a successful writer. First, you must have something to say. Second, you need to have the ability to say it. And third, perhaps the most important, you have to have the courage to say it. In Port Anna, Libby's first novel, published by the preeminent publisher Simon Schuster, she has proven she possesses all 3. I have no doubt that her career as a writer is just beginning. It is my great joy to ask you to please welcome Libby Buck.
Wow. Thank you. It is a great honor, actually, to be here today. Thank you to the Library Foundation, to Bobby and Julianne, who did so much hard work on my behalf. and especially to my aunt, Alice Gorman, for her enthusiasm and that beautiful introduction. So this afternoon, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my inspiration for this book. So, of course, Maine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my writing process, and I'm going to read a few short passages just to introduce you to the characters and the setting. I'm working with the assumption that not everybody has read it yet, and we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. I did want to also note that I find this library an incredibly fitting venue to be talking about Port Anna. As many of you know, my grandmother lived on this island for many years, and I, along with my cousins, spent many vacations here, a lot of spring breaks. And when I take walks, the way I've done every day since I've gotten here, I can't help but hear the old cry of the train when it would speed through town headed for the docks in the south. And we would sit there, my cousins and I, in the afternoons. We put pennies on the tracks, of course, as you used to do, and we would wait for the rumble and screech. And then we would sort of wander for the next hour looking for the flattened pieces of copper in the overgrowth by the side of the tracks. I'm pretty sure my grandmother thought we were playing tennis. Yeah, there are a lot of shenanigans that we got up to on this island, too, by the time we got to be teenagers. And, I had my first drink at the Pink Elephant, something rum-filled and disgusting, I'm sure. And, we bought liquor at the Temp, when we probably shouldn't have been doing that either. But we also took a lot of walks on the beach. My sister and I did that a lot, and we went looking for shells. And some of those shells have followed me from my college apartment to where I live now in Hillsborough, North Carolina, when I am not in Maine. I have very vivid memories of this library as well. Back then, the doors were not open on a regular basis, and when they were, it sort of felt to me like the wardrobe at Narnia had opened up, and I could come inside and read, which was one of my most favorite pastimes. And this little courtyard to me always seemed a bit mystical and magical to me as well. A sort of escape that you, as readers, understand. My grandmother's memorial service was also held in this courtyard in 2009 on a very beautiful winter day like today. So for you, what you'll see, of course, is that for me, Boca Grande is sort of a happily haunted place. And as it turns out, this is quite a theme for me. As you're aware from my biography, I spent over 20 years as an art historian. I taught at UNC. And I promise you, I'm going to take a little diversion here and talk a little bit about that. I promise you there's a link to the book. The first time my husband heard me do this, he was like, wait a minute, she's got the wrong crowd. So I promise. All right. So the subject of my work when I was an art historian was the artist whose name was Gustave Moreau, and you can see his picture right there, looking a little, imperious. And he lived in Paris in the second half of the 19th century. He died in 1898. He was a classically trained artist at the Academy. He won several medals at the annual Salon, which was their annual and sometimes biannual exhibition for contemporary art. At the end of his life, he worked as an instructor at the School of Fine Arts, where he was very, very popular, and I'm going to talk some more about that later on. He had a studio that was extremely well attended. He also, by the end of his life, could say that he had a number of devoted collectors, and they were all sort of drawn to his very weird, exuberant, kind of oddly, at times, disturbing imagery. My faculty advisor, when I said I wanted to write my dissertation about Moreau, she was like, but it's so strange. And it is. The piece that some of you may be familiar with is an early painting of his that is on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York called Oedipus and the Sphinx. And if any of you have ever seen a photograph of the interior of Freud's famous couch and his, treatment room, he kept a replica of it above his, the couch where you would lie down and analyze your dreams. So that just is an illustration of how strange he really was. Okay. But to me, these paintings function a bit like the doors to this library, right? They're magical portals, a transport to another world, one where gods and mysticism abound. This is very fitting for him because this is a man who was, for most of his life, plagued by grief. He was also a devoted student of theology and spiritual traditions. He wrote a great deal about them, and he had the unfortunate tendency to lecture his students and his friends when they would get together over drinks. By all accounts, he was brilliant and warm with his friends, but quite prickly with strangers, and much to my dismay, he really didn't like smart women. So, as I said, this is a man who was plagued by grief. He very much sought an escape from this world. He lost his sister when he was about 12 years old, and his father, who was his greatest supporter when he was a young man. The great love of his life, her name was Alexandrine, married another man. And later on, when in 1870, he survived the Franco-Prussian War and the siege of Paris in 1870 to 71. Most other artists, just for context in this period, like Monet, who's probably more famous and well-known to you, left the city. A very few, if they had the means, stayed. And they would leave, and he stayed because his mother was not well, and he needed to take care of her. During that period in 1871, during that siege of Paris, most of the city was destroyed. So Paris had undergone this huge renovation under Haussmann and Napoleon III. Most of that lovely architecture was besieged and reduced to rubble, and then had to be rebuilt. So, for instance, today when you see the Hôtel de Ville, that is a replica. It was firebombed. It was destroyed and firebombed in that period. So afterwards was really a period that saw a drastic overhaul in French life. Political, cultural, economic, everything changed after 1871. And indeed, of course, the War of 1871 set the stage for the world wars that followed. So at the very, very end of that conflict, just linking this back to Moreau, there were fires that swept through the city. And those particular fires also came very, very close to his home. He could see them from his studio, and it destroyed part of his neighborhood. All right, after the war, in 1872, he began to stand watch as the art world moved on. He'd enjoyed some success and medals, and things changed. So in 1876 is the time of the very first Impressionist exhibition, okay, just for context here, and that quickly gave way to the movements that set the stage for early modernism. So his way of painting really fell by the wayside. So from his perspective, this is a guy who had given up everything in his life to paint. He'd given up marriage, he'd given up children. He mostly had given up a personal life as well, only to see a younger generation completely reject everything that he had stood for. His work faced public ridicule and often charges of antiquated irrelevancy. So he regrouped. He said, I'm fearful that his paintings would end up dispersed or destroyed after his death. He built a museum to house what remained. The galleries, and let me see what pictures we have here. Okay, this is just one portion of it, but the galleries themselves are filled with enormous paintings. We, in the business, in the art history, refer to them as museum scale. They're much too big to put in a private home. They were designed for the crown to build. Now, what's unusual about the ones that are in the Moreau Museum is that they are mostly unfinished. They're large swaths of pale canvas that peek out beneath washes of brown paint, like empty places that are waiting to be completed, and the figures look very much like pale specters. The building itself, where the museum is, and you can visit it today, was designed by his architect father and served as his home for many years. And it included a series, and still does, of what they call the private apartments. And these are tiny little rooms that are decorated with mementos and furniture. And what you're looking at here on the lower right is one of those bedrooms. This is a very old photograph of what they call the bedroom. There's another one that's tucked behind it that they refer to as the boudoir. The boudoir has items that belonged to the great love of his life, Alexandrine. They remained in touch for all of his life, pretty much, and he nursed her when she was dying. The bedroom, what it exhibits are photographs of his students, his friends, his family, his beloved chessboard, his pocket watch, and so on. And what you're looking at on the bed is his suit that he wore as an academician. The museum's former director moved this because she thought the display was too theatrical. I happen to love it, which is why I still show this photograph, but it doesn't look like this today. It's been moved to a chair. Now, what's really, really interesting about these private apartments is that they are a fiction. They are a stage set, a carefully constructed self-portrait, if you will. They were never lived in. The bed was never slept in. Moreau did, however, arrange to die here. He had his students bring him down from where he lived on the 3rd floor and, lay him there so that he could take his last breath, surrounded by his own art objects. Because what's on the wall besides the photographs are lithographs of his most famous paintings. So it's kind of like a performance piece, right? As if he could somehow shift his physical presence from this world into the pictures themselves. So, as you probably have already guessed, for me, the Gustave Moreau Museum is also a haunted place. And this is where my debut novel, Port Anna, picks up. I began writing the book, Port Anna, during the pandemic. And this was a time when I had the time and never needed to leave my desk, actually. And that is a time that was also, like Paris in 1871, of enormous cultural and political and social upheaval. This was a rift in our continuum that caused a lot of loss, right? A lot of loss of routine, of jobs, of social interactions, and of course, most tragically, of loved ones. In the middle of all of that maelstrom, and you couldn't escape the news at the time, I kept returning to this question of how we can heal from that sort of rupture. For me, Maine is where you go when things get tough. And I suspect for a lot of you in this room, you might share that sentiment, or perhaps you have another place that represents that same kind of solace for you. I find a very healing power in the dark woods and that bright coastline. And there's a certain kind of peace that happens when the fog rolls in and everything gets really still and quiet. I had learned that lesson when childhood. When I was 7 years old, my parents bought a summer cottage facing the sea. Right there. As in the book, the house sat behind a berm of rock and heather, mere yards from the ocean. It was tiny, unwinterized, and when the fog rolled in, vapor slipped between the walls. And we had ghosts, and you see them here, sitting on either side of this porch. The pair of professors who had built the house in 1913, and we called them the Misses. They left behind their furniture, paintings, journals, and several photograph albums. The images that you see here come from what remains of that. As a kid, I spent hours memorizing their faces, their pastimes, the names of their pets, and marveling at how much the house still really looked the same. So I'm going to read you a tiny passage. Where did I put my... Just to set the stage. So for those of you who haven't read it, my protagonist is a woman named Gwen Gilmore. Gwen is 40. She has lost everything. She's lost her job. She's lost a relationship. And so the only thing that remains to her is this cottage on the Maine coast that's not winterized. It's really tiny. And it's a site of both some very wonderful but also some very terrible memories for her. So she hasn't been there in over 20 years. And oh yes, the cottage is haunted. Gwen had a picture of the day her family first saw the cottage inherited by her father. Hair ruffled by the wind and salt, her mother beamed at the camera. Gwen's mother, Liza, willowy, red-headed, held one hand to her swollen belly. Gwen, a skinny 8-year-old, held the other. From the dormer window above their heads, a silvery light flashed in the shape of a hand. Soon afterward, the noises began, startling the new owners. The Mrs. Elizabeth Gilmore and Judith Whitehead, the lifelong partners who had built Periwinkle, banged doors and cabinets and caused the walls to creak. "Who are you?" the cranky women wanted to know. "We're your relatives," Gwen's mother had said to the ceiling, "and we love your home." She'd repeated this day after day until silence fell. Because the house had come fully furnished, all artwork, letters, linens, and plates included, Gwen grew to know the misses well. From the photograph albums, she knew they liked to swim every day, wearing funny bathing costumes, dipping into the still freezing June water. One July, they adopted a pair of kittens. In August, their nephew came to visit with his new wife and family. As Gwen carefully turned the pages, they hovered nearby, brushing the wall. She read their books, some annotated in a spidery script, and folded their towels. In the evenings, her family rocked on the porch, watching boats pass by, their sails aloft, just as the misses had done. Sometimes the women left their attic to sit beside them, softly tapping the siding. When Molly arrived, the misses passed through the rooms on tiptoe. Gwen felt them as a whisper, creeping past the baby's door, afraid to wake the golden-haired girl. Little Molly learned to crawl up and down Periwinkle's wooden stairs, scooting on a diapered bottom. Like all who met her, Molly enchanted them. They chuckled when she shouted for her Winnie and didn't protest when she pushed a plate from her high chair, shattering it. As Gwen and Molly grew, they added new treasures to the cottage, and the misses made room. Silvery driftwood, pieces of white-ringed granite, and Molly's art projects sat on the mantel. Moth-eaten sweaters, T-shirts, and old bathing suits remained folded in the drawers all winter, waiting to be reclaimed in June. More than 20 years had passed, and Gwen still knew where to find a sweatshirt when the temperature dropped. It's probably something that's familiar to you when you come back to a house after a while and, things do smell a little musty and things have gotten a little old and there's dry rot, right, in the elastic. So now, unlike the spirits that haunted Periwinkle Cottage in Port Anna, our misses didn't make very much noise. Really, it was just an odd murmur in the walls, sometimes footsteps, a softly closed door. The very first summer, my brother would have been about 2. He would fall asleep giggling, and my mother was convinced he was talking to them. Now, like the misses, though, we also spent our days inspecting tidal pools and exploring the woods, sailing, swimming, and this kind of continuity that was confirmed in pictures made me believe that the cottage would always be there. Our things over time would just merge with theirs, and like them, we would stay forever. So nothing really prepared me or my siblings when the cottage was sold when I was a teenager. And actually, that's the first time the misses got really angry and made a lot of noise. They overturned boxes and slammed doors. And my mother tells a story that before leaving with the final load of books and old bathing suits. She tried unsuccessfully to lock the door, and no matter how firmly she turned the key, the kitchen door would glide open by the time she reached the car. And so after the third attempt, she just left it and drove away. And so we mourned that cottage for many, many years. And in the middle of the worst global health crisis in a century, the missus started talking to me again. I returned in my head to the coast of Maine, because remember, that was a time we couldn't really get places, right? And if you went to Maine, it was a little bit problematic, right? There weren't very many ventilators there. I'm seeing a lot of nodding. Yeah, there weren't very many ventilators, and the people who were year-round residents weren't so excited about someone coming with a foreign license plate. So, and so I sat at my desk in North Carolina and waited for the okay to go back up. So I was there in my head. I went back to the coast of Maine. I went back to that landscape and seascape and to this cottage that I hadn't seen in many, many years, much longer than Gwen had been absent from hers. And I spent hours at my desk daydreaming, carefully recreating where every knick-knack had gone, where every painting had hung, replacing chairs and tables and artwork, and reimagining how the ocean looked from the dormer windows of my old bedroom, and thinking about how the steam used to feel coming up from that old claw-footed bathtub. So mid-reverie of all of this, Gwen Gilmore showed up. She was driving like a maniac over the Piscataqua Bridge. For those of you who don't spend time in Maine, that is the bridge that separates Maine from New Hampshire. It's very distinctive. It's quite lovely. It's got this big arch over it. And she was driving over it at 1 o'clock in the morning. She had streaks of gray in her hair and bags under her eyes. And all I could think was, where have you come from and what has happened to you? Something terrible has happened to you. Why are you so burdened with grief? And I had to know. It felt so urgent to me that I didn't stop and do what writers should do. I know there are a lot of you in this room. I did not write an outline. I just started writing from start to finish. I don't recommend that. I mean, it kind of worked for this book. There was a lot of cleanup that had to happen on the back end, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But yeah, it was a hot mess by the time I finished. But I had to get the whole thing out. Gwen, I learned, was a character who was scarred by the death of her sister. That is not a spoiler. I promise you find out very early in the book. And it is a death for which she blames herself. So she has a rupture in her life, a clear before and after for that, a kind of break. It's a similar one that I hear when we talk about the pandemic, right? How many times do we say, oh yeah, that was before the pandemic, oh, that was after the pandemic, that there is this kind of, canal that separates us from the before. And in her own conversations, Gwen's, she thinks of her life that way. There's a clear line between when she was carefree and bold and fearless as an adolescent and the person that she became after the funeral, careful, wary, prone to self-doubt and self-recrimination. So she's bringing all of that back to the site of this really terrible event for her. And as we know, this takes a lot of courage. She's going to have to face down the ghosts of her past, both literally and metaphorically. The misses are unhappy that she's been gone for so long, and the house has been empty and uncared for. And the friends that she had in adolescence all expect her to be the same person that she had been at 16. And in some ways, of course, being back there, she does too. She mourns the loss of this young person that she was, who had bold dreams and an open heart. And I'm going to read a tiny portion here, too. And in this one, you will meet her neighbor, whose name is Mrs. Condon. That happens to be my mother's maiden name, but it is also a very, very common last name. up where I spend my summers in Blue Hill. For any of you that have read Robert McCloskey, you'll recognize Condon's Garage, which still exists, of course. So Mrs. Condon is a lifelong Mainer, multi-generational. She has a Maine accent, and I am not going to try to imitate that for you. So you'll just have to imagine it in your head. Yoo-hoo! Mrs. Condon smiled at her through the screen. I have something for you. Gwen opened the door. Oh my goodness, you and Mr. Condon spoil me. I forgot that I'd stuck this under the sofa bed. Mrs. Condon pointed to the box at her feet. That summer when your dad came up all by himself and said he wanted to fix the place up so he could rent it, he started to clean out closets and get rid of things, but the missus didn't let him get very far. Anyway, I found these in the garage. Gwen opened a flap. Molly's painted rock stared up at her, one of the crab's plastic eyes askew. Beneath a newspaper, photographs were neatly stacked. Gwen reached for Mrs. Condon's forearm and squeezed, the skin warm, the muscles ropey beneath Gwen's fingers. Thank you, Gwen said. Mrs. Condon covered Gwen's hand with her palm. Yeah, he went a little crazy that year. Can't say as I blame him, poor man. She shook her head. After Molly's death, Gwen's father shrank. His skin loosened more and more each year until it hung from his bones. Well, you have fun putting those back up, dear, Mrs. Condon said as she turned to go. Might remind you of some good times. Smiling, Gwen carried Mrs. Condon's box into the living room and carefully arranged the contents where they used to sit, crabs on the mantel and pictures on the shelf. Molly, in her strawberry hat, grinned, gap-toothed. A photograph of her father's boat, the Liza G, emerged last. Gwen sat on the stern, her eyes fixed on the three boys on the cabin top, Jess in the middle, hat obscuring most of his face, Hugh oiled up and camera ready, and Aiden grinning, his braces flashing. As she held the picture in her hands, the recklessness of that summer returned, a rush in her belly. There was salt on her skin and bonfire smoke on her clothes. The taste of beer, warm and yeasty, filled her mouth. Her body stirred where Jess had once touched her, her face lifted to the night sky, gulping at the air, the stars, the dark trees, and begging for more. She'd wanted more of everything, more hours in the day, more laughter, more sunshine, more of the wildness, promising her that life was wonderful and filled with joy. She wanted it still, her desire so ferocious it took her breath away. A gust blew through the open window, and the kitchen door slammed decisively shut. She jumped, almost dropping the photograph. The second-hand euphoria ebbed, leaving an emptiness behind. You're an adult now, she reminded herself. Grow up. She left the picture face down on the shelf. And again, I think that's something we can sort of relate to, right? This familiar experience, this sort of grief or mini grief that we feel when we grow up, leaving behind this kind of recklessness of youth in favor of safer choices. The difference, of course, for Gwen is that her joy, this joy she's describing, that desire she's describing, caused her sister's death. And that kind of shame can be really hard to overcome. But Gwen is fortunate. She returns to a very unusual place. This is a town named for a powerful woman who has a gift for rescuing the near dead, and her name was Anna Vale. Anna's story emerged on the page congruent with Gwen's. It's a legend of a lifesaver who vanished after her heart was broken. No, Anna Vale is not a real person. People do ask me that sometimes. I went looking for it in Wikipedia. I was like, well, I wrote it, so. Anyway, Anna was inspired by a character from an old novel. His title was also Periwinkle, and that was left behind also by the missus at my parents' house. I still have a copy. It was published in the 30s. The prose is quite stilted and overly dramatic. It's punctuated by things like, oh, hark, you know. But I still loved it. I really loved it as a kid. And the protagonist is an orphaned girl who's raised in a lighthouse by a lighthouse keeper, and she learns from her foster father how to pull drowning sailors from shipwrecks. And that was a common profession on the coast of New England in the middle of the 19th century, middle to the late-ish of the 19th century. So like Anna, the young girl in this book, falls in love with one of her rescues. And for a time, he loves her too, until the sea calls and he's off again. I wanted Anna, though, to be different than this protagonist that I'd read about. I didn't want her to be small and sad and lonely. So I turned her story kind of into a myth, right? And so I'm going to read you just a little portion of that. It did not make it into the final copy of this book, this manuscript, in large measure because it was just too long. But all right, like her adoptive father, Anna rarely spoke. Her eyes ever turned to the horizon. She spent hours playing on the rocks, turning over shells, singing to the sea life. At the sound of her voice, seals popped their heads from the surf, liquid eyes fixed on her face, and lobsters crawled from the depths, trying to reach her. She has a way with the critters, the townspeople said, a little afraid. This was not just because she understood animals. In bright sunlight, her skin glittered, flecked with mica. She had hair so fair it took on the color of the sky or the water, shades of green and blue. Her eyes, too, reflected the weather, by turns gray or turquoise, navy at dusk. Folks whispered that she had arrived on a wave, a child of the deep. Of course, I'm not going to keep going because it gets a little long, but she is a magical child, right, who turns into a powerful woman. And the lighthouse in which she lives is an unusual one. For those of you who spend time in Maine, you know that most lighthouses had homes attached to them, right? Space for the lighthouse keeper's family, their pets. And they had fields, they had gardens. But in Port Anna, there's only a tower. Right. It's a tower that rises from a tiny little island that is accessible only by boat or a little pathway that emerges from at low tide and so is only really usable for about an hour each day in between rise and fall. The interior is also white and the beds curved like bananas. And those did exist, by the way, which, rare, but it existed. So, and here, Anna lives a very solitary life, ruled by the weather and the looming threat of tragedy. She is forgotten not just by her romantic partner, but also by the changing times. With the shift in shipping patterns, right, the transport of goods is replaced by the railroad by the end of the 19th century, the need for her remarkable gift fades, and so does she. She's never voluble, but she starts speaking less and less and less until she never really leaves the lighthouse. Her skin becomes transparent until one night there's a big storm that sweeps through and she vanishes, and she leaves behind a haunted lighthouse. As I said, I was thinking a lot about grief and loss. But you are a room full of readers, right? And you know that art can make sense of sorrow in a way that real life sometimes doesn't. Gustave Moreau knew this. Amidst his own heartbreak, which included both a loss of critical acclaim, as I've said, and also then in the 1880s, the death of Alexandrine, which was an event that nearly broke him, Moreau bequeathed not only his canvases and personal mementos, but thousands and thousands of drawings, all carefully arranged in cabinets that he designed. So that's what this refers to here. This was his original design for these cabinets. They are affixed to the wall, and all of those thousands of drawings are encased in glass, and you can sit in front of them and turn the pages like you're looking at his notebooks. They're actually quite magical. I highly recommend that experience. And you can. It was towards the, he died of stomach cancer, and he was already suffering in the process of designing this museum. So for those of you who don't read French, what he has written up here is this effort was exhausted by pain. So these cabinets, these drawings, these unfinished paintings were in part, of course, meant for his beloved students. so they could learn how he assembled paintings, right? An academic sort of study, it's very rigid how you put a painting together. None of this like imagine slapping paint on a canvas. And so to see them like this, there's a suggestion that he's making art still from beyond the grave, like his hand is helping to guide theirs. He was legendary as a teacher at the academy. His studio was always packed with students. There's some wonderful photographs of them, and I do have a bunch on my computer, which I will run through the slideshow afterwards. He had a signature phrase, "Let yourself go." Now, if that sounds weird, it should. No one in the 19th century was saying things like, "let yourself go." It was contrary to everything that he had learned himself as a student. But it worked. Among his students, he counted Henri Matisse and Georges Rouault, names you probably recognized as two of the greatest artists of the early 20th century, and both of them spoke reverently about him into their old age. Georges Rouault actually served as the museum's first director for over 20 years. So Moreau also taught me, right? Art can heal the living. And as I wrote this book, I was thinking a lot about how much had been taken away from communities and families, and especially children. And of course, my own losses were very present, the cottage, certainly, but also my father and later my brother. And yet, seated at my desk, immersed in description and this house that I had mourned for so long, it was all returned to me. The misses came back to, stomping the floors and rattling the walls, and they haunt me still. In a kind of great way. And then Gwen, who's burdened with grief, is given a chance at another life. So, and I'm going to read one last little bit to you all. So there's another character in this part that also has an accent. And for those of you who read the book, you're nodding because you know who this is. She makes a friend. And he is a very attractive, very charismatic Argentinian artist named Leandro. And Leandro has come to rescue her from a heat wave and take her out on a boat. And you know how it is in the summer, it's in Maine, if there's a heat wave, it can be kind of hard to escape from them because there's not a lot of air conditioning. So, and definitely not in her house. So he comes and gets her and he takes her to an island offshore. Tiny waves lap the hull, encouraged by the late afternoon breeze. There was an exhale to starboard, a chuffing noise. Leandro raised a finger to his mouth. "Shh," he whispered, pointing. "Look who came to see us." Gwen leaned forward. A seal stared back at her, wet eyes unblinking, her own face reflected in the wide irises. "She's lovely, no?" Leandro said, his voice barely audible. Gwen looked into his magic eyes and mouthed a question. "She?" "Too small for a male, I think." The fur, dark gray, speckled with brown, shed droplets of water. White whiskers twitched, nostrils opening and closing with each breath. The creature was both human and not, utterly alien and yet completely familiar. Something passed between them, a sort of recognition, as if she'd once been like Gwen, but then had chosen to shed her skin, seeking the cold darkness, the secret places where tiny octopuses and vermilion sea stars hid. "Oh," Gwen said. She felt the wet warmth of Leandro's body at her back. He made a sound, a small a vibration that caused the seal to blink. She slipped back into the ocean, the water closing over her head as if she'd never been there. They kept their eyes glued to the surface for a few more minutes, but she was off, chasing the flash of a fishtail. Gwen's eyes remained fixed on the water, unable to let go. "Ready?" he said. She nodded, but she wasn't. She willed the seal to reappear. But he cranked the ignition and the outboard whined. They sped past Hart's Island, a handful of boats still at anchor, a few beached by the retreating tide. People stood over a fire, drinking and laughing as they tended to hamburgers on a grill. Children lay on towels asleep. The lighthouse emerged from the haze as they rounded the corner, a white beacon, a swarm of tourists at the base looking upward, some with pants rolled up, feet in the water. When the boat entered the harbor, the tide was dead low. They skimmed over 6 inches of water, the bottom littered with broken shells and old bottles. Gwen leaned over the bow to ensure they wouldn't run into any wayward boulders on the way to the dock. The ramp clanged as they climbed to the street, bodies pitched forward. In Periwinkle's driveway, Gwen said thanks again through the open car door window. "Anytime," he said, "anytime." The El Camino, he drives an El Camino, rumbled away, rocking as the tires dipped into the potholes. In the bathroom, the tub's faucet sputtered, disgorging a mixture of air and rusty water. Once the pipes caught their breath, she pushed the rubber stopper into the drain and filled the tub. She peeled off her sandy clothes and stepped in, sinking up to her chin. Steam rose from the tub, and with it the smell of the ocean. The brine lifted from her pores, a cloud of salt and air hovering about her head. She inhaled deeply. She smelled like the sea, like sweat, like heat and metal, as if she had shed her Gwen skin for the afternoon and followed the magical seal, chasing fish through the inky amnion water. She ran a hand over the soft mound of her belly and hip bones, down the legs to her ankles. She even twisted her arm, palm to her back, searching her backbone for the rise of a fin or the slip of a scale. Water changed things, Leandra had said. And she dipped her head under. So she gets a chance at another life. And it reminds me of my aunt's beautiful poem, Daffodils in December. Impossible, you say, but I stand firm. I hear the voices call me. A burst of yellow trumpets blowing the defiance of spring into the bassoon mouth of winter. Slender green stems, clarions of the spirit, ringing bells of recognition. Madness, you say, as you turn away. Yet here I am, alive with expectation. Thank you. So I am delighted to answer questions, and I think we have some microphones so everybody can hear.
Anyone? Any questions?
And by the way, those are the misses as well here. I forgot to point that out.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hold it up closer, Deb.
Okay.
Sure. Hi.
Obviously, my name is Deborah.
Hi, Deborah.
I really got caught in a scene where she's leaving the grocery store where she's buying supplies, and how in everybody's life, their background or family members have done something that they're accountable for, whether it's death or misbehavior or whatever. And she is not ready to talk about it, not ready to deal with it. And the best part was when she tripped over the threshold, which is very symbolic. And I just wanted to say to you how much I appreciated that.
Oh, thank you.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Can
Yeah,
you
it's
talk a
hard.
little bit about it?
Yeah, so that grocery store, as you have heard, this cottage was loomed large in my childhood and adolescent imagination, and now obviously also as an adult. There was a general store where I did in fact buy penny candy, and back when such a thing would exist. And there was an older man who ran it who was also quite lovely. And there is this sense, of course, when you go back to a place every single summer of an expectation that everybody's just going to pick up where you left off, right? And half of her friends are people that have deep roots in the community and are there full time, and then there are others who are there also only seasonally too. And those, she has to figure out how to build a life that way, and it's not easy. No, she has to learn how to be the person she is now, which is quite different than she was as a child. So, yeah, I I worked on that a bit, yeah, the stumbling, because she's doing a lot of stumbling initially, especially. So even though there are lots of people who are welcoming her with open arms in kind of a remarkable way, really, like nobody's ever forgotten. And I think part of that is also, as I was saying, that when there's a tragedy in a community like that, it's defining, not just for the people it affects directly, but everyone else around them too.
Hi. My question is a little less highbrow. How did you get published?
Oh, I mean...
Not a hint of jealousy.
Okay. I mean, the easiest answer to that is I don't know. But I have an agent who's a remarkable person, and he's very encouraging and very jolly. And he is actually the one who said to me, so although this is the first book to get published, it is, like most of you writers in here, you know it's not the first book I've written, right? And my agent signed me for another book. And that book, by the time I met him, had gone through arguably 6 or 7 rounds of revisions, massive revisions, and then another 2 or 3 with him, and then it didn't sell on submission. So I met with him at breakfast, over breakfast, and he sort of said, well, okay, what's next? And I started talking, and I thought I was going to write another historical novel, and he was like, what's after that? And I said, oh, that's my love letter to Maine. And he was like, that's the book, that's the book. So that's when I really got serious about writing it. I think I got great advice, you know, and he helped. Then it went, after I wrote this book, I told you it was kind of a mess when I was finished because I didn't outline anything. Don't recommend it. And we went through 2 rounds of revisions before he submitted. So it was a long process, and, you know, and then there were other things that the Simon & Schuster wanted to do to it too. So, but how it was kind of a crazy story. A month before my oldest daughter's wedding, Rick, my agent, who also lives in Maine, by the way, called me on the phone and said, Simon & Schuster wants to talk to you. And I was like, wait, what? And my first question was, what do I wear? He goes, it's on Zoom, who cares? I was like, okay. But, you know, it came as a surprise to both of us. You know, as it turns out, I found out much, much later that the editor who bought the book likes ghosts. It's, you know, I don't know how, yeah, so.
Libby, I have a question. Yeah. Your book is so strong in its sense of place. And have you had a lot of feedback from people who live in Maine who have identified with the world that you created there? What kind of feedback have you gotten on that?
People have been incredibly kind. I mean, they might be saying things behind my back, I don't know. But people have been really kind and said very generous things about it. I have a dear friend who's who's in Blue Hill year-round, who works for the fire department, and he said she would never be burning pine logs. That's been illegal in Maine forever. And I said, well, I didn't know that, so Gwen didn't know that either. So note to self, Gwen would not be burning pine logs. But for the most part, people have been pretty kind about it. You know, if I didn't know the answer to something, I had a lifeline to some friends, so.
Does anyone else have a question?
How hard is it to go from writing like an academic to writing this sort of novel?
Really hard. So I stopped teaching in 2010, and part of what occurred to me then, and I know it doesn't sound radical to anyone else unless you're an academic, I had this idea, oh my God, I can write anything I want, right? that was mind-blowing. And my first couple of attempts were, horrible, and really horrible. People would read it and they were like, I don't know what this is. It's like, you're right, it's horrible, I don't know. It probably took me 7 years to lose the academic voice. Yeah, it was a long time. This kind of threat, like, you can't prove that. And in fiction, truth is good, right? So, yeah. But there's a freedom once you do.
I just wondered where the museum is. Did you mention that already? I'm sure you
No,
did.
I didn't.
Okay.
Actually, it's in Paris. It's in the 9th arrondissement. It's right behind Printemps department store. So if you're next time you're there, the subway stop is Trinité, and you kind of go up the hill. So the first time I went there, you used to have to get the key from the concierge, and things were covered in dust. But it attracted the attention of a woman named Geneviève Lacombe, who served as the first full-time curator and director, and she really brought a lot of changes. So the private apartments were closed until the 80s. They never had enough money to keep them open. And now the museum has proved to be so popular. There's yoga and the galleries. And they have a separate director and a curator, and Moreau is now recognized as pretty much the father of surrealism and conceptual art. So he gets a lot more academic attention than he used to. Highly encourage people to go.
Well, Libby, I just want to say you have a lot of fans in this room.
Oh.
I've heard from a lot of people who've read your book, and we've enjoyed it. So I hope
Thank
that you'll
you.
keep us in the loop on your next one.
Coming soon,
and
hopefully.
we'll be following
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you.